Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, how about that thrilling second impeachment? Did you like it better than the original?
I was going to say, rarely is the sequel better than the first, but...
Godfather 2 of impeachments?
But, the same ending, so,
Yeah, predictable ending.
Yeah, exactly.
Very predictable
that's my critique, predictable ending.
I wasn't sure if I need to apologize to the worldos for feeling hopeful on those days when, Mitch McConnell's statements were coming out in real time, but, I think mostly I'm just going to be angry at the Republican Party.
I think what was so weird about it is by the time it happened, I actually didn't really watch much because I was already preemptively angry at how I knew it was going to end. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's like I didn't want to watch and kind of go through the emotional ringer of that just to end with Mitch McConnell caving like he always does and nothing changing.
Yeah. Well, what are you going to do? We got a lot of great news for you guys this week. So we are going to talk about a bunch of stuff. First, there is a fast approaching decision that President Biden is going to have to make about Afghanistan and some new pressure on him to maybe change course. We'll dig into that. Do an update on the coup in Myanmar, censorship in Hong Kong, freedom of information in Mexico, some good news about vaccines, some incremental progress for LGBT rights in the UK, attacks on activists in India and Egypt. Tough decision that the Biden National Security Team is about to confront. So a bipartisan panel called the Afghanistan Study Group released a report last week calling on the Biden administration to slow down the U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan and change our policy there from getting all the troops out on May 1st to a conditions-based withdrawal process. In other words, an indefinite withdrawal date. So the study group argues that the Taliban haven't lived up to their commitments under the peace agreement that was brokered by the Trump administration, that the intra-Afghan peace talks have broken down, and that the security situation is worsening. Now, all of that is unequivocally true. The deal the Trump team cut said basically U.S. troops will get out by May 1st, 2021 if the Taliban renounces international terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and they refrain from attacking U.S. forces. Unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Taliban and al-Qaeda are still close and communicating often. And while the Taliban has stopped attacking U.S. forces, they've escalated attacks on Afghan security forces and civilians. So the security situation is very, very bad. So Ben, here we are again, right? You have a lot of the exact same people, like Joe Dunford, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, led this effort, arguing that we need more troops and more time in Afghanistan, 20 years in. There are currently 2,500 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, about 8,000 NATO forces. The study group recommends increasing the U.S. troop level back up to 4,500. So I'm trying to be fair-minded here, Ben. I think listeners to the show kind of know where we stand on this, but there are real concerns about the security situation, right? There's reports this week that the Taliban has surrounded major population centers. The central government doesn't really control that much territory as it is. There's concern that when Western forces leave, the situation will get even worse. They'll have less control. It could break down into basically factional, militia-based civil war, essentially. So I guess the question becomes, what does Biden do, right? Do you stick with the timeline? Do you try to renegotiate a longer time horizon with the Taliban? Not that I think that's really possible. Do you just tear up the agreement? Do you have a recommendation or a prediction for how this might play out?
Yeah. And first of all, I think that even if you agreed with the instinct of the Trump administration to try to end the war, try to remove our troops, this was done in a completely haphazard and ineffective way in the sense that they did all this diplomacy with the Taliban, kind of cut out the Afghan government throughout most of that process, and then rapidly accelerated the troop withdrawals in the transition, handing off to Biden a peace deal that is not at all being followed by the Taliban. They're supposed to reduce violence in the country, not just cease attacks on the U.S. forces. And they've not. They've escalated those attacks. And then this timetable of May 1st to get all these troops out. And so I think that the right thing to do here is, slow down. Some of these groups like the Afghan Study Group, it was designed to kind of create maximum flexibility for Biden to kind of have a group of graybeards come out and say, you should stop what you're doing and you should add these troops back in. I wouldn't go as far as this group recommends and kind of re-escalating back to a status quo of a couple of years ago. I do think saying, look, we need to take a hard look at what's going on here. We need to evaluate whether or not this peace agreement is being followed by the Taliban. We need to determine what NATO's opinion is about this, because as you mentioned, there are actually more NATO troops in Afghanistan now than U.S. troops, which is a new dynamic. And then I think the most likely scenario, and I think probably the best approach to take right now, is to not kind of resurge back to where you were and kind of keep that as steady state, but to try to negotiate some delay in this withdrawal to create space for more diplomacy with the Taliban and the Afghan government, more alignment with NATO. The question is, of course, the Taliban may say, no, you're supposed to stick to this deal of May 1st. We're not going to agree to some more extended time period here, adding, say, 6 months. I think that's one of the most prominent ideas out there, giving yourself 6 additional months. But I don't think the Taliban is like, by the spirit or letter of this agreement, following it anyway, and so I don't know that they need to necessarily give the Taliban a veto on what they choose to do here. I think they can still say troops are coming out. This is Joe Biden. This is someone who's always been skeptical about what the U.S. military can do here. But, if we yank the plug here now, we could be dealing with a full-blown crisis in the spring that, is unnecessary, and that better to slow this thing down and to try to assemble a diplomatic play that is more effective than the current version of the deal that's in place with the Taliban.
Yeah, I don't know what to think, man. I mean, look, I'm obviously the memory of the full Iraq withdrawal and then sending troops back in is fresh in my head, right? Their argument at the time was that keeping some sort of American residual force might have prevented the security situation in Iraq from devolving. I don't know that that's proven to be true, but that's what some of these same graybeards say, right? The concern, I guess, here is the Taliban have been refraining from attacks on U.S. military personnel. It sounds like if we broke that agreement, it seemed undoubtedly the case that they would resume attacking U.S. personnel. We'd see more casualties. We'd see more U.S. service members die. And I'm just wondering, I wonder what the best case outcome is. Like what, you just incentivize more diplomacy between this sort of like Afghan government-led group and the Taliban?
I mean, yeah, I think if we're honest, like the best case scenario in Afghanistan, at least in the near future, is kind of like a frozen status quo where, let's face it, the Taliban controls pieces of that country, but the Afghan government controls Kabul. There's a dramatic reduction in fighting. Like you want ceasefires across this country. They may not hold, but you want to reduce the level of violence and the suffering as much as you can. And then you want a really aggressive diplomatic effort to try to turn this into some more lasting political settlement in which, obviously the Taliban's going to want some things in the negotiation, but the Afghan government should be able to have like a stronger hand to play than they did last year when Trump kind of cut them out of the whole thing. And even then, that may not depend upon a lot of U.S. troops. U.S. troops, being there can perpetuate a dynamic that is not useful in terms of moving on to the next chapter of the country. But I think the key principle here, Tommy, is like Joe Biden I think he should end the war. I think we should be aiming to, dismantle pieces of our post 9/11 infrastructure in lots of places, including Afghanistan. But he should do it on like his terms, not under like a rush set of terms that Trump signed off on literally in the transition. When, if I'm cynical, what Trump wanted is, either to kind of yank the troops out and say, he did this thing in Afghanistan, or knowing that all hell may break loose in the spring, which is actually the typical time when the Taliban goes on an offensive, and you've got helicopters taking off from our embassy in Kabul, like Saigon in 75, and then he's blaming Joe Biden for what happened. I think Biden just, needs to take a look, make a decision. Not a lengthy, painful review like we had and like Trump had too. I'm not suggesting let's have 6 months and I'm just saying like pause this thing and try to see what, if you can give yourselves a few more months here, whether you can assemble a better looking picture than the one that is assembled right now. Because the one that is assembled right now, seems to lead pretty inexorably to the Taliban being ascendant, the Afghan people being screwed, the U.S. pulling out. There'll be calls for us to go back in. Like, let's just see if it's possible. And it may not be, by the way. We may just conclude, the Biden people may conclude, there's no better that we can achieve here. But it should be their policy, not something that Trump pulled a hand grenade pin out of and handed it to them, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, look, it was a capricious exit by the Trump folks, but also even going back further, I mean, the deal that was negotiated.
Yeah, it's a deal itself. It's less
with
the,
this, yeah. This May 1st deadline, like if the Taliban are living up to their end of it, that Biden folks shouldn't feel bound by an agreement that's not being followed by any parties. But you're right. Hopefully they're just talking about, okay, when are we getting everybody home more than anything else?
And that's the key point. If the Taliban was following this deal and they were really reducing the level of violence across the country and, you know, doing the things that they committed to, it'd be a different story. That's the dynamic that I think you have to address.
Right. Okay, well, we're going to watch this one because the Biden folks are on the record. I mean, John Kirby, our friend, Pentagon spokesman, is on the record saying that the Taliban aren't living up to their side of the deal, so they're going to have to move pretty quickly on a decision here. Let's turn to another crisis that was, landed in Joe Biden's lap, which is the situation in Myanmar. So on February 1st, the military in Myanmar staged a coup. They took control of the government. They declared a one-year state of emergency, and they put a bunch of prominent lawmakers, including Aung San Suu Kyi, under house arrest. There have been nationwide strikes and protests ever since. And then on Sunday night, the military sent troops into cities across the country, presumably to round up government workers who have been participating in these strikes. They're also rounding up journalists and activists. It's a very scary situation. The military, I think, announced basically this they set up like a fake government. They announced that they can indefinitely detain anyone they want. And apparently they let 23,000 prisoners out of jail to make room for pro-democracy advocates. So that is scary. The government has also been shutting off the internet at night. I assume it's to make it harder to organize so that they can't, activists can't warn each other about military offensives and generally just scare the shit out of everyone. Ben, so the situation here seems quite dire and worsening, but these protests are extraordinarily big and brave in context, right? When you think about a military dictatorship coming back, I mean, the fact that the New York Times quoted an analyst who estimated that 3/4 of Myanmar's civil service employees have walked off their jobs in protest. I mean, that's a huge swath of the population taking a very dangerous step. What else are you hearing about the situation on the ground in Myanmar and the strength of this resistance movement in response?
So I have a bunch of friends in Myanmar who are activists, participating in these protests, watching these protests. And I think that on the positive sign, as you said, is that the scale of these protests, is surprised even the people participating in them, that it's so broad. And again, I've mentioned this before, but part of this can be attributed to the fact that younger people in particular, they've had this version of democracy, not a full one, for 10 years. They don't want to lose it. The scariest thing that I've heard, number one, is they're basically beginning to kind of shut down the internet periodically and trying to choke off the capacity of people to communicate with each other. And I've even had people kind of WhatsApp me and say, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to talk to you again, which is this really sad and terrifying kind of message to get. But then the other thing is this release of prisoners from the prisons. This is an old tactic that they used to use way back in the day in Burma, where Aung San Suu Kyi was actually once almost killed by a mob of prisoners who'd been released that kind of attacked the motorcade that she was driving in the north of the country. People have seen this movie before, and what I've heard is they're not just releasing these prisoners, they're releasing them and telling them, go start shit with these protesters, right? So imagine you come out to some peaceful protest, and the military's just released essentially a mob of violent criminals who've been sent there to just kind of rough you up, So it's really a bad underhanded tactics. And so what can you do about it? I think the Biden team announced some initial sanctions, very focused on the military leadership and trying to freeze their money, trying to make it as hard for them to kind of exist in polite society in the world, travel bans and things like that, which is a good place to start. Because I don't think you start by sanctioning this whole country. I think you start by trying to send a message to the military leadership. You continue to go down this road and you're going to be completely cut off. And if you actually walk back from the precipice, and maybe not all of them will, but if you can make an appeal to some of the people in that military leadership, hey, don't follow this guy off a cliff. I think that's an appropriate message to send, while at the same time you get as many countries as you can to join you in delivering that message as well. Like, you don't want to go down this road. If you do, you're just going to be cut off. The population's going to keep protesting, so you're not necessarily going to be able to have a stable situation in this country. You're not going to be welcome in the international community. and you just kind of create as sharp a choice as you can for the military in the coming weeks and months to, try to encourage them to have some of their own internal divisions and have some people say, you know what, we're not going to go along with this thing anymore. So you're isolating the kind of more hardline people and trying to create an opening to return to the democratic reforms that were taking place. I think, candidly, that's still a long shot, in part because the Chinese seem to be okay with this, and they can kind of fill in a lot of the space of, economic activity that is lost under certain kinds of sanctions. But it's worth trying because look how much these people are sacrificing in the streets of Myanmar right now. If they can do that, then they need us to have their backs, and they need as many countries as we can muster in a coalition to have their backs.
Yeah. We'll obviously keep watching this one. One other China-related story I wanted to cover. So last week, the Chinese government announced that they are going to pull the BBC World News Service off of the radio in China and in Hong Kong. This comes after authorities in the UK withdrew a license for the China Global Television Network. And it comes also after a big, harrowing BBC investigation into human rights violations by authorities in Xinjiang, China, over the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims. So this is just, the latest example of the erosion of freedoms that were supposed to be guaranteed to Hong Kong under the one country, two systems system. So Ben, I can't say I'm surprised by this, but I just wanted to continually raise, all these sort of incremental efforts we're seeing to crush, freedoms, crush dissent in Hong Kong. And also, I noticed that Joe Biden said he had a 2-hour call with Xi Jinping. So you have to imagine that, a bunch of the issues we just talked about, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, were central in that discussion. And it was probably not a very fun one.
No, I imagine, it was tense, but the Chinese are always, very calm and measured in these things. So you can't read in the conversation what's necessarily antagonizing them. Look, I think on this BBC thing, the one point I'd make is it can seem like, well, what does the U.S. government do about this? What do we do? Do we kick out some Chinese media? And look, that's worth talking about. But I think the bigger thing is this isn't just for the U.S. government. The reason that China can single out the BBC for their coverage of Hong Kong or their coverage of the treatment of the Uyghurs is because so many other media outlets self-censor in what they say about China. And I'm not talking about just news media. I'm talking actually more about like what kind of movies get made and distributed, what kind of media there is available in entertainment, in news. That
the NBA,
that is candidly just willing to be as transparent about what is going on in China as they are in the U.S. They should be critical of us. They should be critical of China. They should be critical of Russia. And so I think that the reason they can pick off a BBC here and there is that they've kind of cowed a lot of media and entertainment businesses from shining a light on what's going on. And so it's not just on Joe Biden. It's kind of on everybody to decide, am I really going to let the Chinese Communist Party, be in my head every time I greenlight a film or make a decision about whether a documentary gets made or whether or not, we have a series in our newspaper about something that's happening in Xinjiang. There's strength in numbers, because if everybody just decides that they're not going to self-censor like that, well, then China can't necessarily kick everybody out,
Yep. Yeah, there will not be a crooked media Beijing bureau anytime soon.
No. We're willing to be hard hitting, but it's not a lot of money at stake for us. So.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's do some good news here. So some very good news has come out about efforts to stop the coronavirus. So we talked about how Israel has moved really quickly and effectively to vaccinate Israeli citizens. They left out the Palestinians, but they have vaccinated hundreds of thousands of, if not millions of people in Israel, and that has allowed them to collect a ton of data about the impact. So there was a recent study by Israel's largest healthcare provider, and they reported a 94% drop in symptomatic COVID-19 infections among the 600,000 people who received 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine. And that same group was also 92% less likely to develop severe illness. So I just raise this because the data in the trial is bearing out in the real world, and hope is on the way, folks. If we mask up for a while, right, these vaccinations are incredibly effective. We just need more and more of them out there. the more people are getting vaccinated, the fewer people there are to get infected, the spread will slow. So just very, very good news out of that Israeli study.
Yeah, it's great news. And it's a good reminder, too, that like as these vaccine programs roll out in different parts of the world, hopefully we'll also be able to learn from the experiences of other countries, just like they can learn from us, so that not only you're getting vaccines to people faster, but you're able to calibrate what you're focused on based on this data. But this is good news. I mean,
it's really good news.
I'm grabbing for COVID, good news as I begin to go insane in month 12 here, and that was a good day.
Me too. The other COVID thing I saw was the South Korean intelligence service reported that North Korean hackers tried to steal information about coronavirus vaccines and treatments. There's a dispute between the South Korean intel guys and some lawmaker who talked about this publicly about whether or not they specifically hacked Pfizer. But it just made me think, like, again, there's a World Health Organization backed effort called COVAX that is designed to ensure like global and equitable distribution of vaccines. That's going to take a while to get ramped up. I have no idea if North Korea or any other country has the technical capability to manufacture the Pfizer vaccine or these new mRNA vaccines. But it's still like, I read this and I think, I don't really think North Korea is the bad guy for trying to get, a vaccine for its people, even if it requires stealing. Maybe that's a naive or, bad way to think about it. But I don't know. We need the whole world vaccinated, not just because North Korea is full of human beings who we don't want to die from the coronavirus. But if you just want to be fucking selfish about it, you don't want this virus raging through the world and mutating again and again and again, right? We need everybody vaccinated. So I still wish there was some way to open source this information. But,
Yeah, I think I totally think that when it comes to health, like all other political considerations should fade away. You should want every person in whatever country they are, whatever government they're living under, to be vaccinated, because as a moral issue and as you said, a safety issue. And look, this is the darker side of the Israeli story. I saw a headline the other day, Israeli Knesset debates whether to make vaccine available to Gaza.
I saw that too.
Like, make the vaccine available. What
are we debating?
We did no debate. And same thing on North Korea. And because if you also look at the projections of the global vaccine distribution, it's a bit uncomfortable, right? To realize that, there's the US and Europe and China and, South Korea in kind of a 2021 timeframe. And some of the timeframes in Africa are like into 2023 right now. It's like that just should not be the world we live in.
Yeah, no, it should not. Okay, let's turn to Mexico for a very different story. So our listeners have probably heard us talk about the U.S. Freedom of Information Act. We nerds call it FOIA. It's a law that allows the public to request records from any federal agency. It's not a perfect law or perfect process. Some information is exempt. The process can be slow and cumbersome. But like FOIA has helped journalists and activists get all kinds of information, report out corruption, et cetera. Mexico is a similar law and process. It's called the National Institute for Access to Information, or INAI. And in some ways, it's better than FOIA. Mexican authorities are required to respond faster. They have to get back to you within 30 days. And the institute itself can overrule the Mexican government if it tries to block the release of information. So it's been pretty effective. When the INAI was created in 2002, it was seen as this big step forward to fight corruption. Over the last few decades, it has helped reveal huge government corruption stories. It's helped get citizens access to basic information like homicide figures that weren't released. But here's the rub, Ben. President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO for short, wants to get rid of this process. He's complaining that it's too expensive, that it's failed to end corruption. And so transparency advocates and AMLO critics say, this is just a sign of his authoritarian instincts sort of flaring up again. I wondered how much this one worried you, him seemingly trying to shut down what has become a really important way to get information, even if the Mexican judicial system hasn't always proven to be fully set up to prosecute some of the high-profile individuals after this these stories are revealed.
I think it's really troubling, and look, I think this issue around transparency and anti-corruption is right in the zeitgeist of what is needed in the world today. We've talked a lot about corruption, but the positive side is when countries adapt kind of transparency measures and open government measures like this, it builds trust with citizens in their government. it frankly creates a deterrent against corruption because people are aware, like, well, maybe my stuff could be made public, and it kind of it enforces accountability for better governance. So in some countries, particularly corrupt countries at the local level, mayors and city councils have embraced transparency measures like this, where they'll make documents public, they'll show you how budgets are made, and government is better when the people can look over the shoulders of those in power. So across the board, I think a law like this is critically important. It's not just kind of like a side thing. And is it a pain in the ass? Yeah. I've got, the right-wing group Judicial Watch has been FOIAing my every word that they could get their hands on. I'm still getting notices like about them FOIAing stuff from 10 years ago or however long ago related to, Benghazi or God knows what. But you know what? Like, that's worth it to live in a transparent society. And so I there's no way to read AMLO's move. I mean, every time someone says it's too expensive to carry this out, well, you know what's expensive? The corruption in your government if you don't have people looking over your shoulder, So I think this does bear watching. Are there a range of moves, that this is a part of that feel designed to kind of begin to roll back Mexican democracy, and there's enough reason to worry that there might be. Not that AMLO is going to make himself dictator for life, but just as we've learned in this country, you start to take apart democratic norms and practices, and you get worse outcomes.
Yeah, the Washington Post had a good write-up of this whole issue, and it noted that AMLO's been doing these 2-hour press conferences on Friday, and it seemed to suggest that he thought that was the better way to release information. And God help us if the hours-long rambling Trump press conferences were seen as a replacement to FOIA or any other sort of disclosure mechanism. I mean, that's just not credible.
Or COVID, all the information we got on COVID was Trump. I mean, people should check out the Open Government Partnership is a good organization that does a lot of work on how different nations can learn from each other about transparency. Obviously, Transparency International. This is important. This is important stuff that is not just a niche issue because it connects to basically the health of democracy itself.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, here's a story out of the UK that made me happy. So, British men and women who were expelled from the British military for being gay will be able to have their service medals restored. Now, that obviously doesn't fully right the wrong of being thrown out of the military for who you love, right? Some of these individuals lost their pensions. Some even got jail time. But activists welcome this announcement as an important first step, as a longer effort to right that wrong. So until 2000, gays and lesbians were prevented from serving in the British military. About 200 to 250 men and women were thrown out each year because of their sexuality. And in some cases, the medals they had received were physically ripped off their uniforms after a court-martial. Imagine the humiliation of serving your country and that happening. This article, I read about this in The Guardian. It also detailed just the absolute outrageous and absurd lengths that the British military police went to spy on and expose the sexuality of British service members. One guy had a magazine in his room that was found, and they spent 2 years bugging his room and paying informants to get information on him. So it was good to see, the British Defense Ministry begin to address this historical injustice. It's also kind of awful to think that we're talking about late 90s history, right? This is very recent history that we're talking about when people are just treated in horrendous ways for their sexuality.
Yeah, no, it's a great step, but I think it's important that the past is a part of changing these things. There's trauma involved for these individuals, like you mentioned, but you need to set the historical record straight about where you went wrong, about the contributions that people made that were forgotten or attacked in other cases. But also, we feel like things have changed so fast, right? I mean, you mentioned the British change in 2000. We had Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It was only in 2010.
I know.
A decade ago, that the United States permitted people who are openly LGBT to be in the military. That's where we are in this country. And by the way, we're way ahead of a whole lot of other countries. And so it's also important to set an example for the countries that haven't had this kind of tipping point yet. And the military is often a good barometer for the society. In this country, you saw Don't Ask, Don't Tell passed in 2010, and it was a few years later that gay marriage is something the law of the land. I think those things were connected, So I think it's important, to set an example to other countries about how to do this and how to make the effort to support gay rights in the military connected to broader movements as well.
Yeah, great story. I highly recommend reading more about it. Let's turn to India, because we've talked a few times recently about Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India and the disconcerting anti-democratic trends that he is leading in the country. Here's another example. Police in India jailed a 21-year-old activist named Disha Ravi for sending Greta Thunberg, the 18-year-old climate activist, a Google Doc with information about how to support the farmers' protest in India. We talked in great detail about the farmers' protest last week, but the quick version is that millions of Indian farmers have been protesting Modi's efforts to deregulate the agricultural industry because they're worried it's going to, impoverish them, leave them in further debt, and let them, throw them to the wolves, basically the mercy of this big agro business. So the police accused Disha Ravi of trying to, quote, spread disaffection against the Indian state and are holding her in prison under a sedition law. They also accused Greta Thunberg of being part of an international conspiracy against India for tweeting a link to this document. So, Ben, I think this case has gotten a lot of attention because it is just so absurd, right? Like, this isn't some subversive anti-government activist. This is a young woman whose activism to date has been about cleaning up lakes and parks and educating young people about climate change. So I guess here's my question for you. Do you think this is an example of Indian authorities overreaching and screwing up? Or does this seem like they're trying to pick an international fight to send a message that's basically like, don't fuck with us, don't get involved with the farmers' protest, like this is about sovereignty?
I think it's very much part of a kind of comprehensive strategy, like not a fuck up from their perspective. This is what they're doing. One of the things that we didn't spend as much time on last week is the threat to activists. And what you've seen is it's multifaceted. Some people have been targeted with violence, literally. Some people have been detained. Some people have been censored. Some people have been the target of like ferocious kind of Twitter mobs and online disinformation campaigns. So this isn't just like one case of one person, being picked up for this thing. This is a part of like a clear campaign of harassment, intimidation, and sometimes violence against activists. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, like, it doesn't seem to be working. If anything, like the sense of injustice in the government's response is only shining a brighter spotlight on the farmers' core demands to begin with. So I think we, should pay tribute and really send our support out to people who are taking enormous risks. But I think they can also take some degree of encouragement from the fact that while the government has been escalating their response to this, the spotlight's just been getting brighter and brighter and brighter inside of India and beyond it. And, Modi seems to only have one play, which is to get harder and tougher and more aggressive. Again, they really need to pull back from this brink here and find a way to channel this into some discussion with the farmers, some different process. I'm not saying that's, likely, but that may end up being the only way out because this doesn't seem to be abating in any way.
No, it does not. I want to talk about a similar story out of Egypt. So Egyptian security services raided the homes of 6 relatives of a guy named Mohammed Sultan, who's a friend of yours, who's an Egyptian-American human rights activist who now lives in Virginia. This is part of a pattern by Egyptian authorities of harassment against the families of government critics who live abroad. And in this case, from 2013 to 2015, Mohammed Sultan was held as a political prisoner in Egypt. He was brutally tortured, and he is now has a court case in the U.S. Against some of the people who oversaw his torture. But, Ben, we haven't talked about Egypt as much as, say, like Saudi Arabia or the UAE when it comes to these bilateral relationships that are likely to be very different under Biden than they were under Trump, right? Like Trump famously referred to President Sisi of Egypt as his favorite dictator, infamously, I should have said. And he basically gave him a pass on all human rights questions. Do you see momentum in the Biden administration or among members of Congress to rethink the U.S.-Egypt relationship, in addition to a lot of conversation about the U.S.-Saudi relationship, for example, or like the amount of assistance we provide, or just more pressure around these human rights cases?
There should be. I think there's some, but probably not enough, and we should be talking about it more. Mohammed Sultan's case, and he is a friend of mine, but it's a good example. This is a guy, who was detained, I think unjustly, very unjustly, after the coup in 2013, tortured, right? Went on a hunger strike. If you want to hear the story, it's in Missing America episode 6, which is still out there. This is an American citizen who didn't do anything wrong, and then after he becomes obviously a vocal critic of the Egyptian government and its human rights practices, they go after his family because he's exercising his right to free speech in the United States. And by the way, it's not just Mohammed Sultan. There are tens of thousands of political prisoners in Egypt. This is a government that is the second largest recipient of American foreign assistance in the world after Israel. That's wrong. That should not be the case. We should not be giving over $1 billion a year in military assistance to a military that is doing that. And if you want to know the pressures, part of the pressures are a lot of the assistance to Egypt is actually payments to like American defense contractors to make stuff and then give it to the Egyptians. Well, you know what? Like this should all be under review. And I would really like to see, and I argued for this in the Obama administration and usually lost the argument. But like we should not be writing blank checks to someone who's literally harassing the families of Americans after torturing them. Like if you continue to enable that type of behavior, why wouldn't CC stop? So I really hope that in addition to like looking at the Saudi relationship, they are looking at this Egyptian relationship, because this has been a human rights unmitigated disaster, not just for Mohammed, but again, for like tens of thousands of political prisoners in the country.
Yeah. It's also notable, I guess, that Biden has not called El-Sisi yet. He is way down on the list now. I think he's talked to sort of 30 some odd heads of state. The Jen Psaki had to come out today and say that Bibi Netanyahu will be the first Middle Eastern head of state that Biden will call, because the sort of concern trolling in the media about when Biden was going to call him sort of reached a fevered pitch over the weekend. But yeah, I mean, like, this is unacceptable. I don't know how you can possibly support a government with this much military assistance when they're just targeting families of American citizens.
That's insane. Like if that was happening to a country that was an adversary of the United States, like if that was happening in Iran, right?
Right.
Like people would be like, what are you doing to stop that? These are people that we're giving over $1 billion to, who are doing this to an American, harassing his family because he speaks out against what they do. Like that it's just outrageous. Jen, I saw Jen's comment, that when you have to put out statements like that, like it's the kind of, and like posit Jen Psaki's like the greatest human in the world. But it's like the kind of statement that's not going to make anybody happy, because it's not going to make those who are upset that Bibi hasn't been called happy yet, but it's going to make some people unhappy that you still felt like you had to give them, this is stupid psychodrama though, and we used to go through this. I remember, do you remember, Tommy, you were there when there was like a meeting that Obama had with Bibi that wasn't scheduled. It was like scheduled late because Bibi was in town. So it wasn't like a big formal planned bilateral visit. And there wasn't like a photographer in the meeting. And for like the next 5 years, we would get like, why didn't you have photography? There's a lot of focus on these kind of protocol issues that I honestly don't think are that important. They haven't called Bibi yet. Like Bibi was like a giant asshole to the Obama-Biden administration. Big surprise he hasn't been called yet. But you know what? He will be called. He's the prime minister of a very important country that Americans care a lot about. It'll happen. Like, let's just not get too focused on the small stuff here. The bigger issues, like what we're talking about with Egypt, ultimately matter more.
Yeah, there are these weird self-owns in some of these relationships. Like the Churchill bust is another great example. It's like the British press manufactures a controversy about the Churchill bust, which leads to a bunch of hand-wringing about whether the U.S.-UK relationship is as strong as it once was, which becomes this like self-perpetuating cycle of bullshit, which makes everyone then question it. Like same thing is happening here with this Biden-Netanyahu call. Like they talked after the election. They will talk at some point soon. The U.S.-Israel relationship is rock solid. There's probably closer ties among U.S. officials and Israeli officials than literally every single other country, like people that go back decades and decades, right? And yet, like, these issues get manufactured in the press of where you are in the pecking order of the head of state call. It's just such a waste of time.
Yeah, and even as someone who's like obviously a huge critic of Bibi, and we've talked a lot about Iran and the Palestinian issue on this show, as well as some developments in Israel, I care more about what Biden says to Bibi when they talk. than
Right.
about like whether he calls him next week or the week after.
And maybe
Like,
got an election coming
eye
up.
on the
Like,
ball
there's a
here,
lot
guys.
of factors here. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's stupid. Okay, last issue before we get to your conversation with Ilhan Omar, which is, Ben, you are our official British royal correspondent. So there's some news when it comes to Harry and Meghan Markle. But now that they're former royals, are you still comfortable and qualified to break this story for us? How does this work now?
I mean, look, the risk of a bad cliche, like, despite Harry and Meghan's understandable efforts, being a British royal's a bit like the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. And I'll be honest too, like, the reality is, like, they're doing a lot of stuff, right? They got an Oprah special coming out. The news, by the way, we should say, is that they've announced their second child, right? Which is
Very exciting.
Very exciting. A royal baby of people who are kind of semi-royals now. But the reality is, like, they have a giant platform in part because they're former royals, and they're going to be doing this big show with Oprah, and they've got a Netflix deal. So the fact that, people are interested in the fact that there's another royal baby coming just shows that the ties are always going to be there. I saw them getting some shit, though. I'm going to back them up on this a little bit. I saw some people like trying to dunk on them, being like, well, you said you didn't want to be harassed into providing personal news, and now you announced your personal news as if you're a celebrity. And well, yeah, the question is, do they get to live on their own terms? And I think whether or not you agree with everything Harry and Meghan have done, like, people should be allowed to live on their own terms, especially if they're saying that they're not going to be taking money anymore from the royals, and they're moving on here. But look, they're always going to be like seen that way, and that may not be everything they want, and it may not be everything that people who are mad at them want. It is what it is, and very exciting that they have a new addition to the family.
Yeah, and also, Meghan Markle also wrote very publicly about a miscarriage she had, some of the struggles they've had to have a second kid. So obviously, everyone should be nothing but excited for them about this news. They also live in a world where they know that there are an infinite number of news outlets desperate for any information about them still, and willing to sell it to the highest bidder. So of course they're going to announce stuff like this on their own terms. There's no hiding whether or not you're having a kid. That's crazy.
And here to get Harry's back, like, this is a guy whose mom was literally hounded to her death by paparazzi in the press. Like, they have every right to have an extra desire to control their own story and the way they interact with the press. Like, that just is what it is. And I think there's like a human component to that. Right. I don't know why it's not obvious to everybody. Of course, that's what they want, And so they announced they're having a kid. Like, be happy for them. Just say it's good. You don't have to like turn it into like some big indictment of them that how they release this news. Like, let them just do it the way they want to do it.
I got this email from a super nice correspondent at a British outlet who was asking about, apparently there was a meeting between Governor Gavin Newsom of California and Meghan Markle and Harry, and there was some speculation that she might want to run for Senate. So the guy was like, you're someone who is sort of dialed into California politics. Do you know anything about this? And I was like, I don't know shit about California politics. Yeah. California politics is a world in and of itself. I wish I could help you, but I know nothing. But, it shows you how quickly, like, everything gets spun up. Like a meeting with Gavin Newsom that was probably about the foundation. Suddenly there were some rumors out there that it was about a Senate seat.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, just when, because, I can see that, okay, some people might be annoyed. Like Harry and Meghan, they decamped to the U.S. They're setting up shop in California, the Netflix thing. But then, like, these critics consistently kind of prove their point for them. Like, if Harry and Meghan's point was like, you guys are all on our ass, you're negative, you don't respect Harry's lived experience with the press, you seem to be holding Meghan Markle to some higher standard. She's the first, obviously, kind of a black royal of in that position. Like the critics, they can't even have a meeting with Gavin Newsom without it being about some like, ambition that they probably just want to meet the guy. They live in California now.
Yeah, I was listening to Keep It, and I can't remember who made the point on the show, but they talked about how, a lot of people have been watching the Britney Spears documentary, and then because of that doc, interviews of, prominent female actresses in the early 2000s have surfaced, like Lindsay Lohan on Letterman. And you rewatch these interviews from the late 90s or early 2000s, and it is horrific. It is unbelievable that David Letterman is mocking someone about going into rehab in the year 2003. And it just feels like 1,000 years ago. But that kind of coverage and that kind of tone was like what was written about Megan Markle 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It's just absolutely brutal coverage.
Yeah, and the Diana stuff is a trip to go back and look at, I mean, like, because you can obviously see it in like The Crown and stuff, but like if you go back and you look at just the degree of aggression from the paparazzi for that woman, like they, it was just, it's uncomfortable to go back and look at that. And yeah, in this kind of dehumanizing way and gendered way. So you know what, like let's cut Harry and Meghan some slack here, even if they've been a bit clumsy in some of the steps they've taken.
Yeah. Oh, and Jordan corrects me. The Lindsay Lohan interview was 2013, which is
that thing blew my mind.
I couldn't believe he did that.
Let's turn this into a positive. Because and it's funny when I taught at USC and UCLA, and it was dark. It was peak Trump, and one of the things I said to the kids, and I sound like an old guy, right? One of the things I said to the kids is, there's a lot of negativity. There's a lot of stuff to be upset about. But culturally, when I think about 20 years ago, when I was sitting in a college classroom, like the way that the cultural norms have shifted. First of all, like most of the people were white when I was sitting in the classroom, and just the way in which people spoke normally in the culture. Like this is a more progressive country today than it was 20 years ago in so many ways. Our politics can kind of conceal that, but man, you look at that David Letterman thing, and he's treating this like young woman like she's not a person, like she, making fun of her for going to rehab, like, and the audience yucking it up, like it's an applause line. Uncomfortable.
It also makes me think about the birther story and narrative, which, look, Barack Obama politically, he didn't he didn't always talk about race. He chose his moments when he wanted to talk about racial issues. But the birther thing was so self-evidently racist, and it shouldn't have taken him to point that out. Like the press corps should have known, like, hey, this is fucked up. It's racist. Stop inviting him on like the Today Show. Donald Trump, I'm talking about. Stop inviting Donald Trump on the Today Show to lay out these birther rumors in 2011.
No, and like Obama, like this is a hobby horse of mine. We can come back and talk about this, and we can talk about it actually around my book because it's in my book a bunch. Like there was a ton of racism that is going to age in a really strange way in the Obama years. And one of the reasons why he didn't go around talking about race all the time is precisely because of, like he writes in his memoir, when he said it was stupid to arrest Henry Louis Gates, a prominent Harvard professor, in his home. Like his polling dropped precipitously, and then the media had like a 2-week debate over whether he'd made some big mistake that was going to derail his agenda.
Yep. Obama plays the race card.
Yeah, when he's just kind of, and so think of how it's going to look in like 20 years, that when we had our first black president, there was like a multi-year conspiracy theory that he wasn't born in the U.S., he was born in Africa, led by Donald Trump, that a majority of Republican voters believed throughout the whole Obama presidency. That's going to look as weird as like colored water fountains look to us now. I mean, that's what it's going to look like, It
is shocking when you think about it. And thanks again, Donald Trump, for that one.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great.
Really appreciate it. Yeah.